Hey everyone, a friend's Coinbase account was just compromised and the hackers stole $16,000 of Bitcoin. I want to walk through how that happened and how you can keep that from happening to you. Of course, the easiest way is Bitkey. Any Bitcoin that is on Bitkey, you do not have to worry about that. But what happened in this case, and I'll tell the whole story, including, hopefully, the resolution at some point. All right, the only thing that happened is this person's Gmail account got hacked. Best as I can guess, although the facts are fuzzy even in my own mind, I believe the password on their Gmail account was the same password that had been used in other places, and hackers must have gotten a hold of that password to the Gmail account somehow. Best as I can tell, there was not two-factor authentication enabled on the Gmail account, which means if all the hackers needed was the email address and password. Data breaches are happening constantly all over the world all the time, and usernames and passwords, meaning email addresses and passwords, are getting compromised in those data leaks. The very first thing a hacker does when they get a data leak is they go find out if that email address and the password work on Google. And you'll find out why they care so much about that in just a minute here. But anyway, so every time a data leak happens, they go through and look for Gmail addresses, and then they plug those Gmail addresses in with the associated passwords, hoping that somebody is using the same email address and password for Gmail that they are using for Men's Warehouse or whatever it was that got compromised. Just obviously, they're hoping they're the same. As soon as they find some that's the same. So, rule number one, do not reuse passwords. If you are using, you need to use a password manager. The best one, in my opinion, is the Apple password manager that's built into Apple devices. But you need to use a password manager, and all of your passwords need to be different. It is very important. Or even better yet, use passkeys. Passkeys solve all of this problem. So passkeys are much better. But if you're using passwords, because a lot of things still do not support passwords. Okay, so if you can use on any website, log in with Apple or use a passkey, that is much better than a username or password for all the reasons I've posted in various posts. But if you have to use a password for a website instead of logging in with Apple or instead of a passkey, then you've got to make sure your passwords are unique and you're not reusing passwords. Because again, hackers love reused passwords. The very first thing they're going to do is see if they can go use a reused email address and password, or not email address, because everybody reuses email addresses, but your email address and a reused password, they're going to try to use that to log into Google. And the reason they use it to log into Google is because Google oftentimes does not have two-factor authentication turned on. So rule number one is use unique passwords, do not reuse passwords, and do not use generic passwords. Rule number two is get two-factor authentication turned on everything, especially your Google account. The hackers love to get a hold of a Google account because a Google account gives them access to two things that they really, really, really want, which is the Google Password Manager and the Google Authenticator app. So a lot of people are using Google Authenticator for two-factor authentication. And so if hackers get a hold of your Google account, they get access to your Google Password Manager and if you're backing up two-factor authentication codes to your Google account, which I think is turned on by default, then it also gives them access to all those two-factor authentication codes. So they basically have the keys to the kingdom right there. And they can get into any of your accounts, whether or not they have two-factor authentication. Now, if your two-factor authentication is tied to your phone number, then they will try to use the Google Password Manager to log into Verizon or AT&T or C Spire or whatever you're using. They will try to log in and swap over your phone number to a device they control sometime in the wee middle of the night when you're not paying attention and you're sleeping. They'll swap it over and then log in, and then they'll grab the two-factor authentication codes. So rule number one, don't reuse passwords. Rule number two is make sure two-factor authentication is turned on everything, especially your Gmail account. Because again, Google gives everyone, if you compromise a Google account, you have the keys to the kingdom because you have access to the Google Password Manager and you have access to the Google Authenticator app if it's backed up to the cloud, which it is by default. So what did these hackers do? Again, this is my best my best estimation of what these hackers did to steal $16,000 of Bitcoin from my friend. So he woke up in the morning, rolled over, grabbed his phone, and there was a whole series of email alerts from Coinbase. The first said, you have sold $16,000 of Bitcoin. The second said, you have added a bank account to your account. The third said, you have added a second bank account to your account. The fourth email said, you have initiated an $8,000 wire transfer to the first bank account. The fifth email alert said, you have initiated another $8,000 wire transfer to the second bank account. All those series of emails, first thing in the morning. So they, of course, locked their account, but those withdrawals had already been initiated in the wee hours of the morning. So here's how the hackers got into the Coinbase account. They compromised the Gmail account. Through a data breach of some sort, they got the email address and password for some site other than Google. That username and password, they used that same username and password to log into Google. And because two-factor authentication was not enabled on the Google account, they got in. Once they were in, they looked through the password manager on Google and found that there was an entry for Coinbase. They also looked through the two-factor authentication codes in Google Authenticator and realized there was one for Coinbase as well, which gave them, again, all the keys to the kingdom. They then could log into Coinbase using the email address and password they found in Google Password Manager, and they could log in further into Coinbase using two-factor authentication codes from the Google Authenticator app, because they had access to that also because they had compromised the Gmail account. So how do you keep this from happening? Well, again, buy a BitKey, bitkey.world, WORLD. Hackers and scammers cannot compromise your BitKey. It's just that simple. Buy a BitKey, and whatever Bitcoin you keep on BitKey is safe. You're not going to lose it. You're not going to, they've set up BitKey where as long as you have a trusted contact set up, it's basically completely impossible to lose your Bitcoin. I mean, it is a brilliant setup. You do not have to worry about doing something wrong. You do not have to worry about losing your Bitcoin. Just buy a BitKey. That is the number one answer. Now, the good news is in this case, the individual did have the majority of their Bitcoin on BitKey. So if they had not moved the majority of their Bitcoin over to BitKey, they would have lost way more than $16,000. So thankfully, they only lost $16,000, which was a small percentage of their total Bitcoin. If they had not moved the majority over it to BitKey about a month or two back, they would have lost all of it. But thankfully, they preserved the vast majority of it because it's sitting on BitKey, and the only amount that they had left on Coinbase was $16,000, which is what the hackers wire transferred off of Coinbase to their own bank accounts. Anyway, so the way to keep this from happening is BitKey. But the way to keep it from, the way to just secure your account so that other stuff doesn't get hacked, because this is the exact same way hackers get into everything from bank accounts to anything, is their favorite way to do it is to compromise a Gmail account and then use the Google Password Manager and the Google Authenticator app to get the passwords and the two-factor authentication codes to log into all your stuff. And they're basically, they got the keys to the kingdom. So, again, rule number one, do not reuse passwords. Use a good password manager, and every single thing you ever log into should have a different password. Rule number 0 is don't use passwords at all. Every time you can use login with Apple, or you can use a passkey, always use login with Apple. Or if that's not an option and you have the option to use a passkey, use a passkey. Passkeys are not susceptible to this sort of hack, which is why they were invented. Passkeys were specifically invented so that you would not be able to hack people's accounts, the way people are doing it in this case. So, rule number 0 is use passkey or login with Apple anywhere you can. Rule number 1 is don't reuse passwords anywhere. Rule number 2 is get two-factor authentication turned on your Gmail account or any accounts that are connected to Gmail. A lot of people have unique accounts, but they're actually Gmail on the back end. So even if you have a unique email address, if the way you get access to that is the Gmail platform, make sure two-factor authentication is turned on for that. Same with Microsoft. If you're using Microsoft Office 360 or 365, whatever they call it, if you're using the Microsoft platform, make sure two-factor authentication is turned on that. Just make sure two-factor authentication is turned on all of your stuff. And also just be aware that if somebody gets access to your two-factor authentication, or if they get access to your Gmail account, and your two-factor authentication codes are backed up from Google Authenticator, they will also have access to that. Now, that is admittedly is a tough one. The reason I don't go on Facebook and say, hey, everybody, turn off the cloud backup on your Google Authenticator app is because obviously then if you lose your phone or you turn your phone in to Verizon or AT&T or C Spire and you forget to move over your two-factor authentication codes, then it is a royal pain to get back into all your accounts because you don't have any of your two-factor authentication codes. So that is honestly a tough one. The convenient thing to do is let it back up those codes to the cloud. The secure thing to do is turn off the cloud backup. But again, then if you lose your phone, it's a royal pain. Now, maybe a solution is, back up your two-factor authentication codes on someone else's phone. And then that way, if you lose your phone, you can go, move them back from someone else's phone. But there's not a good way to do that real time. So even if you have 10, let's call it you have 10 different entries in Google Authenticator for 10 different, super secure sites with two-factor authentication codes, even if you replicate those to someone else's phone and turn off cloud backup on their phone and your phone, then the question is what happens when you need to add an 11th website login? You got to go track that person down and share that one with them again. There's not a good scalable solution on that. Which again, that's why passkeys were invented. Passkeys were invented because there was not a good solution for two-factor authentication codes, because they have this problem, which is, well, you got to back them up somewhere, but if you back them up, then the hacker can get them. But if you don't back them up and you lose them, it's a royal pain. BitKey solves all of this. BitKey solves everything. BitKey was invented to solve all of the problems related to Bitcoin security and is even better than passkeys and is even better than login with Apple because you have the Bitcoin in your control. So by far the best solution for Bitcoin is BitKey. But regardless, you ought to have secure infrastructure just so you don't get hacked regardless. And the best way to do that is use passkeys and use login with Apple. And don't reuse passwords. Make sure two-factor authentication is turned on, especially for your Gmail account. But anything else you care about as well. And the last thing is in Google and in Apple, you can tell what devices are logged into your account. Just to make sure you haven't been compromised, it's worth going through and kicking off any devices you don't recognize. So you can log into your Apple account just in your phone, and it'll show you all the devices that are logged into your Apple account. And you can disconnect or log out any devices you don't recognize, which are usually old iPhones and old iPads that you forgot you even had, or maybe an old out-of-date Apple Watch you lost or whatever. But it's worth just logging those devices out just to make sure that they're not somehow a device from a hacker that they're hoping you don't notice. And same on Google. It's worth going into your Google account if you have a Google account, and in the settings, it'll tell you every device that's logged in. It'll say, hey, here's a web login from XYZ. Some of those web logins are from your phone or your laptop, but anything you don't recognize is worth just logging out. Worst case scenario, you log back in. Who cares? And, you find out, you're like, oh, I don't recognize that web login from Safari. Well, you log it out and you find out, oh, that was the login on your actual iPhone. Well, so what? You log back in. Who cares? It's super simple. But the benefit of logging that stuff out is if one of those logins is a hacker and you enable two-factor authentication, then you make sure that they don't still have access to your account. Because obviously, if you enable two-factor authentication and they already have access to your account, then they're still going to have access to your account. So it's worth making sure that you log out anything you don't recognize in Apple or Google. So hopefully this is helpful. Now, I'm hoping my friend gets the $16,000 of Bitcoin back. There is a chance that Coinbase will be able to freeze the assets because if they had moved it off the Coinbase platform via Bitcoin itself, obviously Bitcoin's unstoppable and that's one of its benefits. But obviously there's, with power comes responsibility. In this case, because it was moved with an old school bank account, there's some chance that they can chase those funds through the old school bank account system and try to freeze them at some point and get them returned. So I'm hoping my friend gets his $16,000 back. And hopefully Coinbase will give it back to him in the form of Bitcoin or US dollars that he can use to buy back the Bitcoin that the hacker sold on his account. But it's unknown at this point. Anyway, so please buy a BitKey. The easiest way to secure your Bitcoin is $149. Bitkey.world. Just buy yourself a BitKey. If you're not comfortable with it, move $1 of Bitcoin over to it. Just like $1. Just move it and get comfortable with it. Because, again, if somebody calls me and they're like, uh-oh, something bad happened, I'm like, if they have a BitKey, nobody got their Bitcoin. If they don't, you just don't know. Hackers and scammers are everywhere all the time, constantly trying to talk people into giving them access to their accounts, or like these hackers did, because this guy's way too smart to, fall for a scammer, the hacking techniques of compromising his Gmail account, using that to get to his password manager, using that to get to his Google Authenticator, and then using passwords and Google Authenticator codes to get access to his Coinbase account and send money out. So anyway, hopefully this is helpful. Go check your Gmail account right now and make sure it's got two-factor authentication turned on. And go through your Google account and your Apple account and log out any devices or logins you don't recognize. And please be safe out there and get yourself a BitKey. BitKey just solves all this. It's just so simple. It's so straightforward. It's so elegant. And as of yesterday, they even have the retirement feature built in, which is totally awesome. So get yourself a BitKey so you don't get hacked, you don't get scammed, and you just don't have to worry about it. But go secure the rest of your stuff because, you have other stuff you probably care about as well. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.